Peter, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored by your presence here this afternoon. Yesterday evening, I spoke about unidentified flying objects and the beings associated with them. Tonight, I will speak about an unidentified standing person standing on the moon. This is the MoonWoman of the title of my lecture, and we will try to identify this mysterious lady in more than one way. Yesterday evening, I spoke about visions of alien entities that appear in the modern skies from 1947 onward, 1947 being when the UFO phenomenon as we know it made its appearance. This afternoon, I'm going to talk about alien entities that appeared in the sky over the Dardanelles in Turkey one July evening in 1683, and were seen by at least one man. He reports that there were 5 other witnesses to this phenomenon. This man's name was Abraham Miguel Cardozo. He died more than 300 years ago, but I think I know him better than I know any of the modern UFO witnesses. So when I try to get behind his eyes, into his brain, into his feelings, which I know many believe can't be done, and probably it can't, but that will not stop me from trying. When I get into behind his eyes, I feel I am on surer ground than I am with any of the people I talked about last night. You will have to decide whether or not you share my conviction. This Abraham Cardozo is the mystic in the title of my talk, and as I believe the modern UFOs are visitors from our inner space, in my opinion, the MoonWoman was a visitor from his. I made the acquaintance of Abraham Miguel Cardozo via my interest in his much better known contemporary Shabbatai Tzvi. Now, Shabbatai Tzvi is the Hebrew pronunciation of the first name there. I myself prefer to use it. It's conventionally transliterated as Sabbatai Zevi. Will any of you object if I keep on saying Shabbatai Tzvi? And know that this is the name that is usually written, Sabbatai Zevi. How many of you have heard of Shabbatai Tzvi? I see one hand raised back there, and I see another hand raised over there. Both of them professors of religious studies. I think probably most people who are not professors of religious studies do not know of this man. Had you lived in the 17th century, whether Jew or Christian or probably Muslim, you would have certainly heard of him. You would have loved him or you would have hated him. You could not have ignored him. He was a Jew from Izmir who at age 21 began proclaiming himself Messiah for many years without people paying any attention. Then in 1665, something changed. The proclamation of his messiahship was made on his behalf by a brilliant young Kabbalist named Nathan of Gaza. Let me be honest with me. How many of you know what a Kabbalist is? Okay, there's again only a few. Do you know the word Kabbalah? Kabbalah. You know that? You may know it in connection with stars like Madonna, or who dabble in it. It is the Jewish mystical tradition, which in the 17th century was the Orthodox theology of Judaism, which many believed in then, but few understood it. Shabbatai, Nathan of Gaza, Shabbatai Tzvi, were two of those who claimed to have understood it. When, for reasons that we don't understand fully, when Nathan of Gaza made the proclamation, Jews all over the world believed. This was in 1665. Christians at least took it seriously. How many of you have heard of Samuel Pepys? P-E-P-Y-S. Yes, one person. 2, 3. English diarist, whose diary, which was deciphered from code some years ago, gives a wonderful picture of English life in the middle 17th century. And in an entry for February 1666, Pepys describes how he went to his bookseller in London. Now remember, Shabbatai Tzvi is in Turkey. He went to his bookseller in London and found out that Jews were betting 10-1 that a certain person now in Izmir, in Turkey, will be acknowledged, I am quoting Pepys from memory, will be acknowledged within a year by all the kings of the earth, as we now acknowledge the King of England as King of the world, and that this man is the true Messiah. And certainly the year 1666 will be a year of strange doings, but what may come of it, wrote Pepys, God only knows. Jews in Hamburg, Germany, were packed up their bags because Shabbatai Tzvi was their Messiah, would lead them to the Holy Land, would rebuild the temple. Muslim authorities in Yemen sniffed at how the Jews began acting arrogantly, believing that their Messiah had come. And all over the world, from Morocco to London, from Yemen to Poland, Jews waited with bated breath for Shabbatai Tzvi to come and reveal himself as Messiah. Christians sometimes were frightened like Pepys, sometimes eager, imagining that Shabbatai Tzvi would be a forerunner of the second coming of Jesus Christ and would lead the Jews to the Holy Land, where Jesus Christ could appear to them and convert them all in one blow. In September of 1666, Shabbatai Tzvi converted to Islam. Not end of story. Many kept on believing in him even after his death in 1676. One of these was a remarkable man, 1 year younger than Shabbatai Tzvi himself, and in my opinion, far more fascinating. This man was born in Spain in 1627 and was christened at his baptism Miguel Cardozo. He was brought up a Roman Catholic. No Jews known to be Jews were allowed to live in Spain at the time. But Cardozo came from a family that had once been Jewish, and when he was 6, they revealed to him the secret that if he were not careful with it, if he blurted it out, would land the whole family in an inquisitional torture chamber and probably burned at the stake. That is, that they were Jews and were still practicing Judaism. At age 21, Cardozo fled Spain with his brother, got off the boat in Venice, had himself circumcised, took the name Abraham, became a Jew, studied medicine. Actually, he studied it probably from his brother, and studied Kabbalah, learned Hebrew, became a Kabbalist, became a physician, became a believer in Shabbatai Tzvi, and when Shabbatai Tzvi converted to Islam, Cardozo was all the more certain that Shabbatai Tzvi was the Messiah. Why? Because Cardozo, from studying the Bible, had concluded that there were two Messiahs and not just one. Actually, there was nothing unusual about that. When Cardozo later expanded that to four Messiahs, one of them a woman, then that did become unusual. But two Messiahs were part of the Jewish tradition. And each Messiah, he said, was doomed because of the ancient sins of the Jewish people to enter into a false religion. Shabbatai Tzvi fulfilled the prophecies of Isaiah by entering into Islam. The other Messiah was his mirror image. As Shabbatai Tzvi had to be a Muslim, so the other Messiah had to be a Christian. As Shabbatai Tzvi left Judaism and entered into Islam, so the other Messiah had to leave Christianity and enter into Judaism. Would you like to take a guess at the name of the other Messiah? Yeah. He was convinced that he himself was Messiah, that he was Shabbatai Tzvi's mirror. And whereas Shabbatai Tzvi was true Messiah, he was actually a pretty inept and incompetent one. Because the Messiah was supposed to do one thing, and that was to reveal to the Jewish people and eventually to the entire world the secret identity of God, which Shabbatai Tzvi somehow refused to do, and Cardozo spent his life doing. Would you like to know the secret identity of God? The most important piece of information about it is negative. Do you sometimes think, when you think of God, think of the Supreme Being? Think of God as the Supreme Being? So did most people. Cardozo insisted there was a God and there was a Supreme Being, but they were two different things. That God was inferior to the Supreme Being and still was the one who needed to be worshipped. And this message Cardozo took first to the people, took to the various cities in Turkey in which he spent his long life wandering, accumulating excommunications, also accumulating wives. He had at one point 4 wives, although he normally contented himself with 2. He died in 1706, a strange death. He was stabbed to death at age 79 by his nephew. And there is a mystery in his death. It is not a whodunit. We know who done it, but we don't know the why done it. Except for me, I do know the why done it. And anyone who did read my biography. This is not the book that's being displayed back there. This is not a novel, although some have told me that it reads like one. That it is the first biography of Cardozo, written in more than 300 years, together with a translation of his writings. The painting on the cover, I must say, it was done by my wife, who's an artist, using a self-portrait of Titian as a model, but some have noticed a remarkable resemblance to a certain man of today. And there's no question that I do feel a psychic connection with Cardozo. Now, if you ask me during the question period why his nephew stabbed him, I will answer the question. You do not have to read my book. But I don't think I want to get into it here, because I want to stay on the MoonWoman. The MoonWoman appeared to Cardozo, as I've said, in the summer of 1683, when he was living in exile by the Dardanelles, in exile from Adrianople, one of the major cities in Turkey, from which he had been banished. because he said that the Messiah, the dead Messiah, Shabbatai Tzvi, would return in the spring of 1682. Shabbatai Tzvi did not put in his appearance. Cardozo was completely discredited. Supposedly, his enemies had undertaken vigilante action, which was to cut his throat and throw his carcass in some place called Devil's Valley. I don't know where that was. And Cardozo decided that it was time for a good Messiah to flee. And so he was living by the Dardanelles when he had the following experience. On Tammuz 11, 54:43, and this is my translation from the Hebrew. That's July 5th, 1683, 1 hour before nightfall, as I was descending into my garden from my upper chamber, I looked up and saw the moon. I see what appear to be shapes on the moon, I said to people of my household. They looked and said, there are 4 shapes, Messiah ben David, that is son of David, who was Shabbatai Tzvi, who had died 7 years earlier in 1676, Rabbi Nathan, Shabbatai Tzvi's prophet, Nathan of Gaza, who had died in 1680, Rabbi Isaac Luria, a famous Kabbalist of the 16th century, and a 4th shape that looks to be a woman. Now, says Cardozo, I could see them clearly. Okay, so we've got 4 shapes on the moon, 3 of them male, and he thinks he knows who they are. They're ghosts. So, I mean, this talk is quite appropriate for the Day of the Dead, right? Turns out they're not ghosts, but something more terrifying. We'll get to that shortly. And then a woman who he never says who she was, and this is our moon. About a half hour past nightfall, says Cardozo, they began to speak with us from the moon, loudly in human voices. We could hear them as distinctly as though they were conversing with us in the garden. I told them that the spot was ritually pure, and that they might stand upon the trees, which they proceeded to do. They spoke that night for about 2 hours. They imparted attractive interpretations of the Bible, considered according to its literal meaning. They discussed Kabbalistic subjects with accuracy, and after bidding us adieu, they departed. Now, let us hold on to one clear fact before we proceed any further. People do not stand on the moon and step down from the moon to a garden by the Dardanelles. We'll agree to that? We'll agree that this has to be a hallucination. Last night, I think I conveyed that I regard most UFO, or really interesting UFO sightings, as hallucinations triggered by things that are real, but which evoke something inside us. And I don't know what Cardozo saw that triggered this hallucination. I'll make a suggestion later on, but I'm not totally I'm not confident of it. But here is the hallucination, and here the 3 men come from the moon discussing Kabbalah with an expert Kabbalist who is going to give them a test later on. The next day they visited me in my upper chamber, conversing with me as was their wont. I did not recognize them. I believed they really were the Messiah and Rabbi Isaac Luria and Rabbi Nathan. The story now turns dark and ominous. For 3 days, the 3 spirits come to visit Cardozo in his chamber, apparently discussing Kabbalah with him. Notice that the shape that looks like a woman has vanished from the story. For reasons that he does not explain, Cardozo is troubled by the fact that the spirits initially appeared within the moon. He begins to suspect they are not quite who they seem to be. Are you really Isaac Luria? Cardozo says to the spirit who bears Isaac Luria's shape. And Luria says, or the spirits, the ghost says, yes, I am. And then Cardozo proceeds to quiz Luria on Lurianic Kabbalah, which Cardozo knows very well, and realizes that the person he's talking to is an imposter. And gradually, who they are becomes clear. They begin to speak to Cardozo. They protest their good intentions. They've taken on the shapes of deceased holy men out of pure love for him in order to disabuse him of any false belief he might happen to hold. It is the first cause, this is the Supreme Being, who decides of its own will who is to be the reigning deity. Remember that the first cause, the Supreme Being, is not God. Now, sad to say, the sins and disbeliefs of the Jewish people have brought it about that the deity in whom you believe and whom it is your goal to proclaim the world over has been stripped of his power. That is why you are doomed to a life of harried wandering, deprived of all repose, persecuted and scorned, why you cannot succeed at anything. You have seen that in Yahweh's name you were promised redemption. Now referring to the previous spring. Yet that promise turned out to be a fantastic lie. The truth is it is Samael, Satan, who now holds the power, and that is why the Gentiles dominate the world. Well, of course, by now Cardozo knows who he's dealing with. You know, of course. They're demons. And they've come to seduce him into heresy. It's Shabbatai Tzvi, or rather the demon who's taken on Shabbatai Tzvi's name, taken on Shabbatai Tzvi's shape, who speaks most powerfully. And stepping out of the story for a moment, I would say that I think this may be a clue to how Cardozo really felt about his fellow Messiah. So here's how the spirit, the demon in Shabbatai Tzvi's shape speaks. He says, you maintain, do you not, that we come from the demonic realm, that your God's dominion encompasses everything, and that he therefore rules over us, that this is the God who drowned Pharaoh in the sea, who sent an angel to wreak slaughter in Sennacherib's camp because he had blasphemed him, who worked his will also upon Nebuchadnezzar. Well now, we are heaping worse blasphemies upon him than any of them ever did. And here they spoke the sacred tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, with the most virulent insults and curses, and challenged me to call upon him, let him send fire to burn us up. I answered them, if there is any God other than the Lord, that Lord whom I recognize and in whom I believe, for whose sake I suffer all those torments you have mentioned, I curse that God. You believe in some other God other than him who is rightly called by the name Yahweh? Then let him be banned. Let him be damned and his name be damned. Now go ahead. Ask him to send fire to burn me up. Horribly, the demon god does. Not many days afterward, I fell dangerously ill of the disease called calsos in the physician's language, but which in lay language is called fiebre ardiente, burning fever. One of those spirits came and stood at my bedside, all dressed in black. And Cardozo, in another version of the story, also told by Cardozo, he says that one of those black-clad beings stood for 14 days by the head of my bed. Now, I dwell on this detail for those of you especially who heard my talk last night, that this is the first time the three men in black make their appearance. 270 years later, they turn up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where they terrorize a UFO researcher named Albert K. Bender into discontinuing his UFO researches. Of course, human beings do not live 270 years any more than they climb down from the moon into Turkey. And yet it looks to me like we're dealing with something more than an individual hallucination of Cardozos. If they can come back centuries after Cardozos' death. Here I would say, Dr. Jung, please call your office, that we are dealing with archetypal entities, and I will return to that. Because after all, we still haven't explained who that woman is, have we? And here's eventually Cardozo recovers, eventually he banishes the demons. He says to them, off with you to Salonika. And later goes to regret his words, because several months later he receives the news that the Salonican believers in Shabbatai Tzvi have converted en masse to Islam. And he knows that they've been seduced by his demons. Before they go, they have a message for him. How long will you keep on persecuting me, I asked them another day. And then they give him an answer that made my flesh crawl when I first read it. Until you are dead, for it is our God's pleasure to do to you as your God did to Pharaoh. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have told you Cardozos' story. I can tentatively suggest an explanation for it. I'm going to tentatively suggest that this was all a fever hallucination, which he projected back to the time just before the onset of his disease. Okay, so we've got it all explained, right? But of course we haven't. We don't know why he has this hallucination. And why, especially, who that woman is, who appears once and then never appears again. Somewhat over about 12 years ago, I went to a colleague, a valued colleague whom Peter knows well and values as I do. His name is Lance Lazar, who I know is a specialist in the religion of the Middle Ages of the early modern period. And I said to him, Lance, do you know anything that Cardozo might have picked up in 17th century Spain about a woman standing on a moon, on the moon? And he said, yeah, piece of cake. Any of you recognize that? Who is that? Who is it? Yeah, Mary. And not only Mary, but the Mary of the Immaculate Conception. Now, I need to explain what the Immaculate Conception is, because I think most people don't understand it. They think it's the same thing as the virgin birth. I remember reading one writer who said that in the late Middle Ages, Catholics came up with the idea of the Immaculate Conception because they didn't want to imagine the Mother of God doing it. And I have to tell them that the Immaculate Conception has nothing to do with the Mother of God doing it. It has nothing to do with Mary's sex life or with the birth of Jesus, but with the belief which became dogma at the end of the Middle Ages and which was extremely popular in 17th century Spain, that the Virgin had been born without the taint of original sin. That is to say that we are all born with a bit of the sin of Adam. By a miracle, Mary, alone among humankind, was born without original sin. And in order, one of the key proof texts that the theologians who believed in the Immaculate Conception came up with for that is from the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation, where John of Patmos says, I saw a woman standing on the moon, clothed in the sun. And so Mary, the Immaculata, the Mother of God, born without sin, stands on the moon. Does anyone know who painted this? This is my, actually, and the crown of stars is from the book of Revelation too. Does anyone know who painted this? It's the Diego Velázquez. Now, some of the imagery of the standing on the moon goes back somewhat before this. Here's El Greco, not painting the Immaculate Conception, but painting the Assumption of the Virgin, Mary being carried up into the heavens. Okay, and you see there, she's the moon, this time a crescent moon, is used as the vehicle to carry her up. But that imagery, this was done, 1577 to 79. This imagery was picked up by Velázquez and many others to depict the Immaculate Conception. This painting was done 1618 to 1619, which is about some 8 or 9 years before Cardozo was born. And remember what I told you earlier, that Cardozo was born and brought in Spain and brought up as a Catholic. Now, we don't know whether he would ever have seen this painting. Okay, now these are a couple of other. This painting was done by Velázquez's teacher, Francisco Pacheco. You see that he did not quite have Velázquez's talent, and here, but what makes the Velázquez's painting almost unique, except for Pacheco's, is you see her standing on the top of the moon, and the reasoning is clear because if she's clothed in the sun, obviously the moon will shine on its top, right? Okay, but the more common practice was to depict her. This is another picture of the same painting by Pacheco. The more common practice was to depict her standing in the crescent moon. Now, this sculpture, this is a panel behind the altar in the church of Santa Maria in Medina de Rio Seco. It was carved by the sculptor Juan de Juni in 1557. Why is that special? Because Cardozo was born in the town of Rio Seco in northwestern Spain. So he may or may not have seen Velázquez's masterpiece. But surely, when he went, every time he went to church, which he did all through the first 20 years of his life, he would have seen this picture of the woman standing in the moon. Now let's see, I think I can use this as a laser pointer. Yeah, you see the woman, and you see the crescent moon there. And we're going to do a blow-up of that. There she stands. You see the crescent moon that she's standing in. Now, do you make out something that looks like a snake's head here? Yeah, can you see that? What's that doing there? Anybody want to take a guess? What's that serpent doing there?
This represents the devil.
Represents the devil, and why is it there? Oh, this man has given you the clue. Why would the devil be between the moon and the foot? Foot, devil, moon. What's the sculptor trying to convey with that? Sir?
Well, a wild guess, but the Eden story comes to mind. And if she is immaculately conceived, then it takes you back to the story of where original sin came from.
Yeah.
And there's something in there about crushing the serpent's head under your
Good, good. Remember Genesis 3, that I will set enmity, God says to the serpent, I will set enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and the woman's. Thou shalt bruise his head, and he shall bruise thy, that he shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel, right? And now it's transferred to the virgin herself, who by virtue of her being born without the sin that the snake had brought on humankind, the virgin crushes him beneath her heel. Okay, now let's imagine here. I'm going to sit here. Here I am. I am little. Brian, is this okay? Can you still pick me up?
Yeah.
I am little Miguel Cardozo, 8, 9 years old, staring at that lady. Then I grow up. I keep the name Miguel, but I put Abraham before it, naming myself after the first convert to Judaism, who was also the great spiritual pioneer, discovered on his own the nature of God. And now I study Kabbalah, and I learn that there is a divine female in the Jewish God called the Shekhinah, the presence of God, and corresponding to the Shekhinah, there is a demonic female, Lilith, the mate of Satan. And I remember that the lady in the church is there with the snake, and I give it a slightly different meaning, right? That the lady is the snake. That in rabbinic tradition, Kabbalistic tradition, the snake is identified. The snake of Genesis is identified with Lilith, the female, the mate of Satan. So, and Cardozo does write in one of his treatises that he writes in one of his dozens of theological treatises that Lilith, the mate of Satan, is the woman whom the Christians call Mary. And he describes, he says, when I was in Spain among the Christians, they think Mary is more important than God. They worship her even more than they worship Jesus. He says when I used to go into somebody's house, we weren't supposed to say, and it's interesting, he uses the phrases in Spanish, but he writes them in Hebrew letters. He says we weren't supposed to say alabado sea Dios, praised be God, because then we'd sound like Jews. Instead we were supposed to say Ave Maria, Hail Mary. So here Cardozo, having spent 20 years imagining, seeing, painting sculptures of the mysterious lady who rules the night sky, comes to know that she is really a demon, but she's still part of his unconscious. Okay, we're not going to stay in the Rio Seco. Let's go to the nearest large town. This is Valladolid. This was a sculpture done by Gregorio Fernandez in 1632. Valladolid, I think, is about 20 miles from Rio Seco. Cardozo in 1632 would be, 5 years old, right? Okay, how this sculpture was, although eventually it was set up in a church, it's carved very ornately in the back, from which we know that it was designed to be carried in processions. So although Cardozo doesn't actually say this, I'm going to imagine, and I'm writing a novel about Cardozo, which I will put this. I imagine that he was taken by his parents to adore the new and glorious statue of Our Lady as it was carried through the streets, because after all, that was a good way for people who were perpetually under suspicion of being secret Jews to show their devotion to the Blessed Virgin. And there he was, 5 years old, gazing open-mouthed. Now, there's no snake under her feet. What else do you see under her feet? 3 angels. Ding, 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 ding. Are they male or female? Yeah, they look male to me. You see where I'm going. Now, the samples I'm giving you, please don't believe that these are the only depictions of the Immaculate. And by the way, there was, my wife several years ago was part of an artist group, and her name is Rose, by the way. Rose was part of an artist group, and when their meetings were over, we'd go to a Mexican restaurant, and I noticed there was a Virgin Mary, painting of the Virgin, and I looked under her feet, and sure enough, there was the crescent moon. Next time you see a painting of the Virgin coming particularly from Hispanic lands, or people of Hispanic background, look at her feet, and I will be willing to bet you that you will see there a crescent moon like the one here. This was Juan Martinez Montañez, the Immaculate Conception from the Cathedral of Seville, 1631. You notice again the 3 male figures. If you wonder what they're doing there, I suspect they come from the older iconography, the older depictions of the Ascension of the Virgin. After all, they've got wings and they can carry her up. And I imagine Cardozo, as a little kid, must have thought, well, they've got wings, she doesn't. So if they want to fly down from the moon and visit us, they can. She can. Notice again there's 3 of them, and I have to admit they're not always 3, but normally the number tends to be 3. Okay, this is Giuseppe de Rivera. I'm in connection with Seville. I need to mention that, I'll make sure I have got this right. Oh no, okay, sorry, I'm glad I checked, because this is Giuseppe de Rivera, which was displayed in the convent church in Salamanca. Cardozo's brother was a Fernando, later took the name Isaac, was a medical student in Salamanca, and I don't know that Cardozo came to visit him there, but why not? And that's the sort of thing Cardozo might have seen there. And finally, here's some paintings by Francisco de Zurbarán, who was one of the most prolific painters of the Immaculate Conception. One more. Okay, you understand my explanation of that hallucination. How easy it is to imagine tiny Miguel open-mouthed with awe before such paintings or sculptures of the mysterious lady who rules the night sky. Easily the seductive images penetrated his unconscious. There they remained, even as the adult Abraham came to repudiate his childhood faith as a devilish caricature of religion. Even as he came to conceive the woman on the moon as a supreme she-devil who might be attended by demons disguised as spirits of holiness. One summer evening in the darkest time of his adult life, the childhood images burst from his unconscious in the form of a compelling, devastating hallucination. I'm convinced that's true. But I'm also pretty well persuaded it's not the whole truth. How many of you have ever heard the word quaternity? Nobody. Okay, do you know what a Jungian archetype is? That according to Jung, we as a species have in our common psychic heritage certain patterns of organizing reality that we share with all other humans. And these are what Jung called archetypes. And they crop up independently in different cultures at different times. One of his archetypes is the quaternity, the number 4. And he thinks that this archetype is what we use, this pattern is what we use when we want to convey a sense of wholeness. And he says that the archetype is usually in the pattern of 3 plus 1. That is to say that there are 3 beings who are more or less the same, and the 4th who sort of belongs with the other 3, but is somehow different. Are these ideas familiar to any of you? Jung wrote a fascinating essay called Psychological Approach to the Concept of the Trinity, in which he argued that the Christian Trinity is a mutilated quaternity. That the full quaternity is Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and the devil. And that Christianity erred terribly by banishing the devil from its quaternity and leaving only the Trinity. Very often, sometimes also though Jung thought that the 4th member of the Trinity, of the quaternity, was the Virgin Mary, who was purged in favor of the 3 male entities. Cardozo uses, quaternities crop up elsewhere in Cardozo. For example, I told you he said there were 4 messiahs. There's the Messiah descended from David, namely Shabbatai Tzvi. There's the Messiah descended from Ephraim, from the tribe of Ephraim, namely himself. There's Moses, and then there's the 4th Messiah, who is a woman. And again, he says that she's the woman prophesied by Isaiah, who brings good news to Zion. But nobody except Cardozo ever speaks of a woman Messiah. I think here there is a divine quaternity. On the moon, Cardozo sees a demonic quaternity. And I think those 2 explanations, they don't contradict each other, but they complement each other and they strengthen each other. Because the Jungian archetypes, to me, take on the garb of the culture in which they appear. And who knows, possibly the reason why the Catholic painters tended to have 3 cherubim with Mary was that the archetype of the quaternity was operating through them. Now, I'm going to need in a moment to give you some time. I hope everything I've said has been clear. To the extent that it isn't, please let me know. And this, of course, this Jungian theory will explain why the 3 men minus the woman, and I was once asked who is the woman and I couldn't answer, show up in Bridgeport, Connecticut in 1953 to scare Albert Bender into stopping his UFO researches, because I believe UFOs are also an archetypal phenomenon and that they span the generations. Leaving aside the UFOs, I want to give 2 footnotes, 2 endnotes to this talk. Endnote number 1, a man, we have the writings of Agobard, Archbishop of Lyon, who wrote in the early 9th century. And in one of these writings, he describes how he was just in time to stop a lynching. Now remember, Agobard lived 2 or 3 times longer before Cardozo than we live after Cardozo. The mob had gotten a hold of 3 men and 1 woman and claimed that they had fallen from an airship from a place called Magonia, which sails through the air, like a UFO, to carry off the goods, the crops that are destroyed in hailstorms. And Agabard eventually, who regarded the whole thing as a ridiculous superstition, managed to persuade the crowd to let these people go. But why did they think that 3 men and 1 woman would be coming from the sky? I think there's an archetype of malignant beings coming from the sky, 3 men and 1 woman, that crops up independently through the centuries. That's footnote number 1. Footnote number 2, which I think the faculty here and the visitors will get. I don't know how many of the students will get this. This is the last picture I'm going to show. And tell me, I've already asked who was the lady on the moon. Now I will ask who was the gentleman on the moon. How many of you recognize him? Yeah. Who is it? Khomeini. Khomeini, the Ayatollah Khomeini. I know many of you younger folk will not know Khomeini, but he was the man the religious figure who led Iran after the Shah was overthrown in, was it 78, 79? Which one, do you remember? 79. Okay, now, lest you are open-mouthed in amazement as to how, I mean, you've got the whole thing. You've got the standing on the moon, you've got the treading on the devil, you've got the cherubic faces, the whole thing. And if I can pick up my notes, I will tell you this was sent to me by my friend Professor Jane Hathaway of Ohio State University. She had heard me give a presentation of a version of this at a conference in 2000, and she sent me this. It's taken from Peter Chalkowski and Hamid Dabashi, Staging a Revolution, The Art of Persuasion in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And she wrote to me in a letter, the Iranian artist obviously doesn't know quite what to do with the crescent moon, and he seems at some pains not to make it look as if Khomeini is actually floating among clouds. On the other hand, he plays up the trodden serpent, doubtless meant to represent the US, Israel, Saddam Hussein, or some other great Satan. One of the cherubs is holding red tulips, which in Shiite iconography, or at least the iconography of Iran in the 1980s, represent martyrdom. These sorts of images virtually deifying Khomeini and glorifying martyrdom proliferated during the 1980s, especially in connection with the Iran-Iraq war. What's amazing is how they disappeared during the 90s. I think you'd be hard put to find anything like this in Iran these days. Thus far, Jane Hathaway. Thus far, my talk. Thank you.